We'd like to thank our sponsors who made today's program possible. HouseMart, Maui Sons and Daughters of the Nisei Veterans, Maui Health, Abbey Carpet of Maui, Sei Design, Mune Kiyoharaga, Puro Water Specialty Company, and Maui Disposal. Mahalo. Aloha, and welcome to An Afternoon with the Author. My name is Deidre Teagarden, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Nisei Veterans Memorial Center, where our mission is to inspire people to find the hero within themselves through the legacy of the Nisei Veterans. We are so thrilled to have with us today author Julie Checkoway, who is actually launching our series for us. This series is where we are inviting authors from across the state and the nation to come and spend some time with us on an afternoon and talk to us about the journey behind writing their book. So before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to go over a few quick housekeeping items. Number one, we encourage question and answer. So you'll see the little box at the bottom of your screen. Please type in your questions there and we will get to as many as possible. We are recording this and it will be available on our Nisei Veterans Memorial Center YouTube channel for future viewing. And because we are in webinar mode, you can see and hear us, but we can't hear or see you. So please know that your privacy is protected. And with that, it gives me a great pleasure to introduce our author today. Julie Checkoway is an author, freelance writer, radio, podcast producer, and documentary filmmaker. Most recently, she has been reporting for the New York Times on the coronavirus in California and on the case of an Iraqi refugee wrongfully accused by the Justice Department of a murder he allegedly committed as an Al-Qaeda operative. In 2019, Checkoway ghost wrote Targeted for former Cambridge Analytica employee Brittany Kaiser. Her previously authored books include the New York Times bestseller, The 3-Year Swim Club, which is currently under development as a major motion picture with director Destin Daniel Cretton, who did The Castle and also Just Mercy. And screenwriters, the Candle brothers, who did Moana and Adrift. Her other books include Creating Fiction, a best-selling creative writing primer, and Little Sister, Searching for the Shadow World of Chinese Women. It was a book that chronicled the year she lived in the People's Republic of China prior to the protests in Tiananmen Square. In 2008, the documentary that she wrote, directed, and produced, Waiting for Hockney, premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival and aired on the Sundance Channel. Following the making of the documentary, Checkoway was a full-time staff writer for the Salt Lake Tribune, where she covered art, film, and books. She has also produced and reported work for This American Life and NPR's All Things Considered. Checkoway was educated at Harvard College, the Iowa Writers Workshop, and the Johns Hopkins Writing Seminars. And for many years, she was a tenured professor of creative writing at the University of Georgia, and also served as the director of the nation's #1 graduate creative writing program at the University of Houston. A native of Massachusetts, she currently lives in California with her wonderful husband and brilliant, accomplished daughters. I added those adjectives. We met Julie in the summer of 2017 at a UH Maui college event organized by Joyce Yamada, who is on our call today. So hello, Joyce. I was sitting at the table along with our board president, Brian Moto, and research archivist, Melanie Agravante, and the three of us simultaneously turned to one another and mouthed the words, annual dinner because we wanted her to come out and speak at our annual dinner. So after Julie's talk, I went up to her very gently and introduced myself and said, would you consider speaking at our annual dinner? And she so graciously and immediately said yes. So that was the start of a very lovely friendship with Julie Checkoway. And we are just so honored to have her on the call today talking about her book, The 3-Year Swim Club. Let's give a very warm virtual welcome to Julie Checkoway. Julie, welcome.
Oh, thank you, Deidre. I am super grateful to you for making it possible for me to be here with everyone today. And I remember that day so well. It was wonderful to be at the University of Hawaii at Maui and to have Joyce invite me. And then it was amazing to meet you and Brian and Melanie, and to be connected to you guys. And we've enjoyed having you visit us here in Sacramento, you and Sean. Shane, sorry.
Like the cowboy.
Yes. Like the cowboy.
Come back, Shane. Yes.
Yes, of course, because he's been in my house and we've had dinner. And so anyway, we've really enjoyed knowing you and your mom, who I think is on the call. So it's really been a nice family experience too. And I love being able to come to the center, I guess a couple of years ago when we all could still travel and address the lovely gathering at the annual dinner. So I miss being there, and this is a virtual way of being with you today.
Well, we are so happy that you are and with us. And I know that once we're all able to travel again, we definitely want you to come back out. But in the meantime, we are going to be 21st century and do this all virtually. But so, you know, we have a lot of people on the call who've read the book, of course, who may or may not know the story behind the story. And not everybody knows how the story of the 3-Year Swim Club actually came to you. So I thought it would be nice if you could kind of give us a little brief history of how that came about in the first place.
Sure. It's and for those who have heard this story before, either at the center or in some other form, I apologize. So in brief, I am a serial looker, searcher for great stories. And I had just finished doing a documentary about a young man who was an artist who went on a quest to create the most amazing pencil drawing ever done. And it was a pretty tragic quest, actually. It resulted in a movie, but it was a hard story to write. And I was really looking to write something about someone who had made a significant difference in the world and whose quest, if there had been a quest, might have resulted in something that changed lives instead of sort of what I had followed for about 8 years on film. And I had said to my literary agent, this is what I'm looking for. I'm hoping to find a story that meets those criteria. And gosh, I don't know if that's possible. So I started looking, and then one day she called me from New York City. And she said, I was just at lunch and I heard this story about these swimmers, and she began to tell me the story. And we both acknowledged that if that story about the 3-Year Swim Club was true, then it not only met all those criteria because it was astounding and it was about somebody who had made a tremendous difference and about young people who also had gone on to make a tremendous difference, but that it was sort of a writer's dream come true in the sense that it just was bold and big and beautiful and offered so many opportunities for me to learn. That was the other thing, is that I've always wanted to learn from every project that I've done. And if I'm not going to learn something, really, really learn something, then it's not worth doing. And I had to, in acknowledging that this story was out there, I had to acknowledge that I knew nothing about Maui, that I knew nothing to begin with about really Hawaii, very, very little. I had done a little bit of work in the 90s on the mail order bride business in Hawaii, but I had not really looked at Hawaii in a larger sense. And I also didn't know much about Japanese American life. I also knew nothing about swimming, and it was like diving in head first. And fortunately, what happened was, as with every project, you start out as a writer and you begin to make phone calls, emails and phone calls to find out whether what you're hearing about a story is A, true, B, whether there is any extant material on that story, and C, whether you have the ability to tell that story, access that information, or engage with people, whether there's room to insert oneself, if you will, into the storytelling, or whether there's not room. And many times I'll examine a story, a possible story or a book project, and I'll find, for any one of those reasons, that the story is not true as told to me, or secondly, that there isn't enough material to even back it up, or three, that there's someone who's not willing to share that information because either it's dear to them, or it's tender to them, or there's a territorial sort of intellectual property issue going on. And so all those things then have to be sorted out. And so they're stumbling blocks, but they're important things to establish. And as I began to ask those questions, I called up a guy named Keith Arakaki, who I don't think is on this call, but some people might know of Keith because he heads the Hawaii Swim Club in Oahu, in Honolulu. And he is the heir to Coach Sakamoto. He was a swimmer himself, and he was the person that Coach Sakamoto turned the club over to. Now on Maui, the person who's taken over from Coach Sakamoto in a way is Reed Yamamoto, right? And so Reed now coaches although I don't know if he's coaching right now because of the coronavirus, but Reed has for years been the Coach Sakamoto heir. So I didn't talk to Reed originally, but it was with Keith, and Keith was so generous and so loving and so excited and so thrilled, and he had this massive tranche of materials that he was willing to share with me. He had this crazy website that still exists that has all this stuff about Coach Sakamoto and all the 3-year swim club swimmers, archival information, but he also knew people who would potentially speak with me. And he was kind enough to make introductions. And when I asked him, he said there's been a play written about it, or there is a play being written about it, but there's never been, and there was a documentary that had been made back in '84, and there was nothing that kind of pulled it all together at that time in sort of one big place. And I wanted to know whether there was room for someone like me who didn't have any experience with any of those subjects and was an outsider from the mainland to come in and actually sort of tell that story and what that would mean to people. So that was how I came to it, and some of the issues that I brought to it when I heard about it.
Right. One of the things that I've heard you say often is that, it's not your story, it's the community story. And I think you just touched on that, but what makes you feel that way? And it being the community story, how did the community receive you? How did the families receive you?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, about whose story it is and who owns the story and who has a right to tell the story. There are lots of ways of coming at telling it, and there are so many different ways of thinking about it. And this ties in with the movie, actually, with the status of the movie project and how different people. Sorry, I think you may hear sounds from my computer that I don't know how to shut off. Did you just hear a ding?
I did not.
Oh, only in my ear am I hearing
Perhaps.
dings. Okay.
I'm hearing,
So
yeah, my own.
yeah, it's really tricky. My goal, my my ideal goal with writing the book was to gather all the materials together, if people would allow me to see them and process them and sort of digest them, metabolize them. And by bringing them together, take the shards, as I call them, the shards of the story, and sort of put them back together the way, what is that Japanese art where you put things back together? There's craquelure. It's a very specific art for the remaking of vases. I
Oh,
can't
right.
recall. Yeah. And so there's a way in which you take this sort of shattered vase and you put it back together with a kind of glue, but the pieces were already there. And so that's what I felt to some degree of what I was doing. And in order to do that, I had to go to other people and ask for their portions or their shards and ask their permission to add those to this whole. And then I had to think about too, well, what is my relationship to that whole? You know, who owns it? Well, certainly I put it together, but it does need to go back to the people who own it in its component parts. And so there are always ownership issues when you think about this. But have I told you the story about the little stones that I brought to people? I don't know if I told you this story, but I was so
No.
nervous when I reached out to people who were still living. The swimmers, many of them, about 9 of them, were still living when I started. And most of them were, as I have said, crisp of mind. There were a few who were in memory care at that point and remembered some things and not others, but most were those who were living were pretty able to remember. And so I had some Skype visits, but then in 2011 or 12, I came to Oahu and then to Maui for the first times. And when I came, I was terrified. As an interloper, I was just terrified. People had agreed to see me, not only the swimmers themselves, but in some cases when they had passed away, they had, given their children some of the stories, they had given the children their scrapbooks and things. So I was really nervous. And I lived in Utah at the time. And I collected these fossils. They were these little fossils of fish. I don't recall what they were, what they actually were, but they were about, hundreds of thousands of years old. These little tiny fish on pieces that were no larger than about an inch wide and half an inch thick and maybe an inch long. So each one had an embedded fish. And when I visited each swimmer or the families, I would hand the fish over and I would say, I brought this to you because what I'm trying to do to shift from the vase metaphor is to take this fossilized story and to bring it back to life. And that's what I have no other motive than to do that. Will you allow me to do that? And I don't know, I just knew in my gut I had to bring something. I didn't know much about Hawaiian culture or AJA culture, but it was the right thing to bring something, going to people's homes.
Definitely.
Yeah, and so I learned fast that was a good thing to do. And there's a funny story that I think I have told before to you, which is I was meeting with Blossom Young Tiao, who was a Maui native, and Ivanel Ho, who was a later swimmer for Coach Sakamoto, and Pachi Tsukano and his wife. Pachi was one of the original 3-year swim club members, along with Blossom Young Tiao and Pachi's brothers. Anyway, Shengi and Johnny, who many people will remember because they were all in the 442nd. They also had very distinguished careers. John especially wrote about it. So anyway, so I'm sitting in Ivanel Ho's backyard and we're having some food and I had to get up and go to the bathroom. And I didn't shut off my recorder. And I didn't do that intentionally at all, but I had been recording and I went to the bathroom and I came back and thought nothing of it. And the meeting seemed to go well. I had handed out my fish and we had talked story and we'd eaten some Viennese wieners and we'd eaten some musubi and we'd eaten some other things that Pachi said, this is a typical, breakfast on, this was a typical way of eating and we had a really nice time. But I left thinking, I have no idea if that went well. And about 6 months later, I was home in Salt Lake City and I was listening with my little earphones and typing out the transcript for that interview. And I got to this point where I must have gone to the bathroom and the recorder was running. And I could hear Blossom, I think, say to Ivanel, what do you think? And Ivanel or someone said back, I think she's sincere. And then someone said, I think so too. And it was like, oh no, she's coming back. So that I was like, oh, and I started to cry because this was about at least 6 months in and I hadn't listened and I didn't know yet what people thought. And I thought, okay, well, that was a good sign. Maybe that was good. And the other sign that it was going well, almost too well, was that I visited Bill Smith, who was at home, and some of the other people. And every time I would leave people's homes, and I've told this story too, I would walk out and they'd say, oh, you can't leave without taking this. And they'd come out with big bags, duffel bags and shopping bags full of archival materials, scrapbooks, wow, and belongings, really. The original three-year swim club patch that Sakamoto designed and that Mary helped sew, and just, I mean, really very valuable things. And we would negotiate. I would say, I don't think you should give that to me. And they'd say, well, of course we're going to give it to you. You'll send it back, right? You'll take it to the mainland and send it back. So I think that made me feel I was trusted, but I also felt a tremendous responsibility to make sure all that stuff got back and copied and so forth. So that told me it was going okay most of the time, but I would always check in to, how are we doing? Am I making you too tired, asking too many questions? Bill Smith would sound really tired and he'd say, no, you're making me remember. Oh. And that was really nice.
How nice.
Because I would ask him things like, what did it feel like to be in the ditch? What did it feel on your body? And he'd say, nobody asked me that before. And I'd say, okay, this is good. So I felt like maybe some of the stories that he had told again and again could kind of crack open and he allowed me, and people would allow me to ask maybe questions that hadn't been asked before, that were about a level of detail that would be of value for them to experience in retelling.
Well, I think the book is so intricate, and I mean, it starts in 1930s Waikiki. You give that whole overview, and there is so much detail. You really get lost in it, but it's so beautiful, and you even for those who might know the story, I think you bring out all these side stories and under stories. It just really brings it all to life. And as you take the shards and you create the vase, I think it was Carmen Matsuda just wrote in and said, I think that you're talking about the kintsugi, where you put it all together. Yes. And then Joyce said the whole idea of wabi sabi, where there's this perfection in imperfection and all of that. But another thing you often talk about is how lovely the experience was. And that is such a delicate word. Was this a very delicate experience, or you use the word a lot, and I just wanted to see what you meant by lovely.
Oh, it's a good question. Lovely is the only word I can think of to describe what it was, and I was reflecting on this. I think it required a delicateness to engage with people, because I was messing with their lives and with their memories of a time that was both incredibly fulfilling and necessarily disappointing, because in many cases, well, in all of the cases, nobody was able to go to the Olympics except for Bill. And for the original team, that was really difficult. And talking about it as a difficulty was really delicate. Part of that's cultural, part of that's just plainly personal. And so being delicate was part of it, but that was also the loveliness of it, is realizing that, you know, this isn't just a story, this is people's very personal lives. It's about their life projects, their immortality projects, to use the term of Ernst Becker, the historian and philosopher, psychologist. This was about their immortality project, what they had done in their lives. And it was such a gift that they were willing to share with me, or in the case of the children, to talk about their feelings about their parents, whether their parents had actually shared some of these details with them. Sometimes I would be in a position to share more with the children than the parents, the swimmers, had shared with their own children. I would say, did you know that your father was, you know, in such and such and was friends with so and this happened in this race? And they'd say, no, he never told me. And so there was this give and take from the storyteller. Who was the storyteller and who was the story giver and who was the story hearer? So it was about being in relationship to each other that was so lovely. I think, given that I'd had a pretty challenging experience with the previous work that I had had on the film, with somebody who wasn't a giver, he was more of a taker, that this was such a reciprocal experience and it was such a familial experience. My sister is actually on this call. She's on this Zoom call, and she will nod, but she and I grew up in a family that was, the nuclear family kind of split apart when we were pretty young. And I found so much healing and so much love in engaging with the warmth of the swimmers and their families and being in their homes and the incredible kindness that was offered to me. I felt, I mean, you know, the term ohana is very meaningful. I felt at times, rightly or wrongly, that I was being welcomed and treated like ohana, and that was an incredible privilege. So I think that there's that. Yeah, it was, because it was such a privilege, it was so lovely. If that makes any sense.
So, I mean, obviously it had a big impact on your life. And how about your family, your family's life? They were part of this too, I'm sure, in, even if not, you know, super connected, they, you know,
Yeah.
you were there, they were there with you. So what kind of impact did it have on the family?
Well, the kids were really small when I was, relatively small when I was doing the research. So my youngest daughter was really, well, actually, she was probably 4 when I started, and the older one was 10. So they grew up around the dining table hearing me say, oh my gosh, I just discovered that in this race that occurred in, 42, that, you know, I'd sort of tell this incredible story that I thought was incredible, and they'd sort of roll their eyes and go, uh-huh, Mom, you know, I've heard enough about swimming. But what was really nice was being able to bring them to Hawaii and have them see it. They never got to see it. I think it wasn't really clear to them until maybe I came to the University of Hawaii at Maui, that they saw people who had come to a talk, I think, that I was giving, and they saw people, like regular people on Maui, who were touched by the story. And I think that that brought it home to them. It wasn't just about their mom telling a story about people who were so far away. I think there was some meaning for them in it. My husband was great during the writing of the book. He was teaching, but mostly he was an administrator at a school. And he became really very much the full-time dad. He did the laundry and he did the cooking. And I had the privilege of writing all the time and traveling. And I thought the least I could do is take the kids to see the world that that I was writing about and meet some of the people. So we had some wonderful dinners with some of the older swimmers, the second generation of swimmers, with Sunny Tanabe, who's an Olympic swim champ, who lives on Oahu and who is very helpful. He made some of his famous cipino, I think it was, for us in his home, and got to meet some of the other people as well. So that was really lovely.
Well,
Again, right?
yes. When we put out the Zoom registration email, so many people wrote back with their own little story about the book or about the coach or reading the book. And so, definitely it has touched a lot of people in different ways. But yes, as you talk about your children being able to really have the people come up to you and engage with you, that continues to this day. And a lot of people on the call have their own stories. Um, what is something that you want people to take away from this book?
Oh, that's such a good question. I've been thinking a lot about the resonance of this book lately. It's been, when I visited with the swimmers and they would talk about their experience on the team, and they would talk about Coach Sakamoto in particular, and they would talk about what happened to the team in general. The term sacrifice came up again and again and again. Bill Smith said to me, what coach taught us was sacrifice, sacrifice, sacrifice. In order to get something and be something, you have to give up a lot. And in order to achieve anything, you have to give up a lot. And life is about sacrifice. And I would listen to that and I would just try to, so that's a lot of sacrifice. And I was thinking about the specifics that Sakamoto asked the kids to sacrifice. And that would be, no, drinking, no smoking, no girls if they were boys, no dating if they were girls, no candy. And so in that way, there were these basic sort of daily sacrifices. Sacrifice your sleep to get up in the morning and go twice a day, and sacrifice your energy and give of yourself. Sacrifice your free time to engage with a club. Give up baseball. In the case of Kyo Nakama, he had to give up baseball, which he loved. His nickname was Casey at the bat because he just loved baseball. And coach caught him one day, I think as I chronicle in the book, and said, you can't play this anymore. You have to devote yourself totally to swimming. And I think because they had also seen, not Bill, but his parents had sacrificed for him as well. But the kids who were AJA and the kids who were Filipino and were children of the sugar plantation workers had seen their parents sacrifice so much for them and wish so much for them, that I was really struck by how this book is about sacrifice. And then when the Olympics were canceled in 40, there was great personal sacrifice in that all of them except for Bill, all were unable to go on to be Olympians. Now, Fujiko Katsutani waited years until her certificate arrived from from the AAU that said she had actually qualified for the Olympics. She knew she had. She was actually on the women's 1940 Olympic team. The boys were just, they were on the mythic Olympic team in the sense that the trials hadn't been held, but they qualified. But Fujiko actually literally went through the trials, qualified, didn't receive her certificate till she was in her 50s. And there's sacrifice there. So today, I think about COVID and I think about the things we're meant to give up in service of other people's health and service of other people's lives, and how we're being asked to stay home and to give up. I mean, athletes today are giving up the Olympics, at least for now. We don't know if they really can be held in 2021. But there's such an interesting unfortunate divide in the country at this moment about care for others and sacrificing for others and achieving something as a team. And I think today I would say the message is that you can sacrifice for others and for a team, and there's so much you can achieve if you do that. And I think that's just one of the messages I've been thinking about lately. I've also honestly been thinking about the oppression that the team members faced in terms of racism and prejudice. And we see a return of that these days in terms of response to people of Asian ancestry. It's been a long, couple centuries of prejudice, and we're sort of back there. And these were people who fought, Coach fought against prejudice, the kids fought against prejudice. They met it at every level, and they met it through the rest of their lives. And I think, endurance and finding ways, there's so many creative ways to fight prejudice. And this was an incredibly creative way to do it. There are lots of ways of doing it to be subversive, and swimming was just their tool to do it.
And then, of course, some of them went into the 100th Infantry and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And toward the end of the book, you have a page that says, these boys, because they were young men. These young men went in, fought, and the ditch wigglers, right? They were called, and
ditch wigglers, yep.
And they survived. They survived Coach's team, and where did that come from?
Tremendous survival. I mean, some of it may have been luck, and so the luck of the draw, because perfectly capable, hard fighting, strong kids didn't make it back home. But at the same time, there was some kind of other determination. I do think there had to have been tremendous luck as well, because wonderful people who died in that war didn't die for lack of sacrifice or lack of strength. But it was kind of remarkable that they did all come home, and they came home and did amazing things. They led really honorable lives. They were teachers, they were coaches. One became a congressman and was involved, and everyone was involved in the channeling of energy into the transformation of politics and the face of Hawaii at the time. There was tremendous energy that people put into, changing Hawaii and changing the world.
Yeah. We often talk about, it was at a club luncheon in 1952 when some of the men of the 100th and 442 got together and adopted that motto of continuing service, where they wanted to make it better for that next generation. And for us here on Maui, it resulted in our center. But you could see that everywhere, and they came back and they all did something. They really did something big. But I'd like to switch and talk a little bit about Coach. I mean, Coach Sakamoto himself was such an innovator. And reading the book, I didn't know that he came up with all of these new types of swimming and coaching styles. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? He did a lot.
It's amazing to me, because in that he was isolated in many ways on Maui, he didn't have a lot of resources at his disposal. He had some books. He had seen some swimming. He had seen, actually, Duka Hanamoko had come to Maui when Coach was probably in his 20s. So he had seen him swim. He had coached basketball and, little tots kind of basketball, and he'd been involved with the Boy Scouts. But he created this, he was a polymath, and he created this incredible regime of training, but also of, he invented swimming all over again, is all I can think of. He invented it whole cloth in some ways. he got into the furrow and he asked himself, how does water move? And how does a body move in water? If I move my hand in the water this way, where does the water go? How then would I move most swiftly through the water with the least friction? Hence, what would be the best stroke? And he was inventing things as he was going. When he wanted to strengthen the kids, it seemed natural to him to give them weights to strengthen their arms. He gave them food, but he also, and Mary, his wife, Mrs. cooked for the kids, made sure that they were nourished because many of them were undernourished. And he had them begin to lift weights, you know, the big wheels on the from the railroad yard. He would take off the Mighty Eight, and he would scavenge all this stuff, and he just created an outdoor weight room, if you will, with pulleys and chains and ropes that he would scavenge from the plantation. And you know, he had probably read that, you know, lifting a weight might be helpful, though it was not really done in swimming at all. And he integrated that into their training. He had them train year round, do dry land. He had them run. And then in the pool itself, because he had studied a little bit of running, the fartlek method, F-A-R-T-L-E-K, which came from Europe, he thought, oh, well, they say that in running, you should run very fast and then slow down for a while, run very fast, then slow down for a while. I'll try that in the pool, hence interval training in the pool. He was the first person to try that. And he found that it seemed to build the kids' muscles faster. It seemed to increase their cardiovascular capacity. And it just made them swifter swimmers. So he did all of these things, and he built the stuff by hand, and he designed it by hand. Keith Arakaki had at one point at the University of Hawaii some of these rudimentary machines that he built, and they look not unlike the machines we would use today in a gym that we can't go to anymore, but they look like some of the weight and resistance machines. So he was doing resistance training. It's really remarkable. Then stroke technique. There was no such thing as stroke technique back in the time that he was doing this. You put your arms over your head, and it was said that you should keep your head, you know, at a certain level in the water, but there was no experimentation with that, no sort of scientific work with it. And he used the scientific method, and he would ask, and he would adjust the kids' arms all the time and adjust their strokes. And he was constantly adjusting everything about their bodies in the water, everything about their regime, their food. And that's what is done today. It wasn't done then. And he wasn't acknowledged for it at all. When he would talk about this stuff, and the other coaches on the mainland would overhear him, they would say, oh, he's talking that voodoo again, you know? And they you know, they use the term voodoo, which I thought was really interesting. You know, this primitive sort of witchery. Yeah. And it was science, it wasn't witchery.
Wow. And someone had written in a question, if you had an opportunity to interview Coach or talk to Coach or say something to Coach, you know, what, I mean, I'm sure there are so many things, but, you know, is there anything that pops to mind that you would want to just either acknowledge him for or say to him?
Wow. You know, no one's ever asked me that question. And I just tried to imagine myself in a room with him, and I've never imagined myself in a room with him. I've never allowed myself to imagine that. Okay, so I'm just trying to think. My first thought is terror. I would have absolute terror to be in a room with him. As a great admirer of him, I would feel tremendous terror about asking anything of him. Also, he was very formidable. I think, you know, he could really frighten those kids. He was pretty tough on them. This was a different generation, discipline was different. So I don't know how I'd feel. I'd be really nervous. I think I would want to ask him, what I've always wanted to know is the truth. If there is a truth that he'd be willing to share from the deepest place in his heart, what did he really feel? Really feel, honestly, when he was passed over and mistreated when he was passed over for the Olympic coaching job, which he should have had. He should have been made Olympic coach. And he always said publicly, oh, it didn't matter at all. It didn't matter at all. But I would have liked to have heard him speak frankly about his rival coaches and the way they treated him. I think that's a very contemporary question, but we're having such frank discussions about race right now. We're having some real discussions about the pain and hurt that people have felt, the real injustices that have occurred. And I would hope that if we were sitting in 2020, that, and he were here, that we'd be able to have a frank discussion about representation and whether and how he truly felt all those years. I'd love to have that out and hear what he really thought of Bob Kiffith, the Yale coach, who was his arch rival and his worst enemy, and what he felt about, you know, E.L. Damkroger and the plantation folks. Yeah.
But as a result of this book, still staying on Coach,
Okay.
you were tell us about his portrait in the National Portrait Gallery. That's huge, and I think a lot of people don't know about that.
Yeah, it's really, I think of all the things that have happened. There's so many wonderful things that have happened as a result of having the book out in the world. Among those things are hearing from people who remember him or whose parents swam with him, hearing from people on the plantation who said, oh, I lived down the way from Kionakama or Halaharosi, or I was across from Jose Balmores, or I swam in the ditch, or, you know, even there's some people who actually are still living who remember Coach really well. There are people, there are Olympic swimmers. I met a woman named Gail Roper who lives in Santa Rosa. And I think she came to an event I did somewhere and she said, oh, I knew him. And then she sent me a picture of him. So there's just this kind of great networking thing that's gone on where people, his memory has been lifted up through the book in some way. And it's begun to live, you know, beyond him through the book a little bit more and connect people to each other. But what happened was I got an email a couple years ago, probably about 2 years ago, 2.5, from the curator of photography at the National Portrait Gallery, which is part of the Smithsonian. And she said, you know, I just read your book and I'm wondering why Coach Sakamoto isn't in the portrait gallery, you know, where George Washington's portrait hangs, where, you know, Martin Luther King's portrait hangs, where now Barack Obama and Michelle Obama's portraits hang, where true heroes and heroines of the suffragist movement, of the abolitionist movement hang. It's where anyone who has made a significant mark on American history, American culture, has a portrait in this place. And I said, well, that's a really good question. And, you know, that'd be wonderful if you're interested in having a picture of Coach. And so I was able to help her get to the Sakamoto family, to Dennis Takata, who is his son-in-law, and Reen, his daughter. And they came up with 2 photographs that they then gifted to the Smithsonian. And last summer, our family was able to travel to the Smithsonian, and we got a tour from the curator, and she walked us through these hallowed halls. We had a private tour in the morning before any of the other museum goers were there. So we walked through and we saw these portraits, and we came to the room in which Sakamoto's portrait is, and they rotate one of the photographs with the other every couple of years, just because they put it in archival storage and then they switch it back out. And, you know, on the wall is Toni Morrison, and on the other wall is LL Cool J, and on the wall is, you know, like some major sports figure, and, you know, really, really important people. And there's it's a small photograph. It's smaller than I remembered, but there's a photograph of Coach Sakamoto with a little bit of a story next to it, and there he is. So
that's amazing and wonderful and lovely.
But, it was great.
And to have that personal tour, how exciting, and to know that it came from your book. I mean, that's got to be incredibly special.
It was, but also what I loved was you had provided me on that trip with a beautiful lei that was made by someone at the center. And I was able to deliver that to the curator and thank her from the people of Maui for her efforts in putting the photograph there. So I hope to connect you guys a little bit more and connect Maui to the museum, maybe as things get open, and maybe we can do something more. You and I have talked about trying to connect the people of Maui to the Smithsonian and to that photograph, which is a representation of what Maui is.
That would be wonderful. It was Auntie Joyce Kawahara. Her husband Hideo sits on our board, and she makes the most beautiful eyelash lei. And yes, she was honored to do it.
Well, I was honored to be able to give it to the curator, and she was blown away. Absolutely blown away.
Fantastic. We are running out of time, but we do have a few questions coming in. I'm going to read them off. Let's see. How long did it take you to write the book, start to finish?
Okay, so I began in earnest really in earnest in 2012 when I came to Maui. I probably started a little bit earlier looking into it in 2009, but from 2012 to 15 is when it came out. So that's only 3 years. So probably altogether 5 years of mulling and so forth, but 3 heavy years of researching and writing. It always seemed longer because it was a very deep process, but yeah, about that long. Yeah.
Okay, and then someone said, truly, were those ditches deep enough to learn how to swim?
Oh yeah, I don't know. So the person maybe is not on Maui, or maybe the person hasn't seen the ditches, but if you take a look, if you go anywhere on Maui, you will see that the ditches are truly deep enough. The ones that are right by the school are quite deep, and they are also paved. They're concrete bottom, the ones that he was using. And today you could get it. Are the ditches still, is there water still in the ditches? Last time I was there was.
I do not know the answer to that question exactly, but I'm sure that sometimes there is. Maybe.
When we went to scout out for the movie, we were looking at what was left because the plantation was just shutting down.
Right.
The mill was shutting down, and we were looking at the ditches, and everybody was like, yeah, you could swim in there. And yeah, absolutely. They were absolutely deep enough and wide enough, although they were probably about as wide as a standard lane is now in a swimming pool. And you had that many kids in there swimming up and down and up and down. So it was a lot of kids. I mean, 100 kids could be in the ditch at the same time. And he was so organized that he could have them going up in rows and back in rows and up in rows and on the bank and climbing up. You know, he just had this incredible way of being organized with all of them and making it fit. Yeah.
Okay. Last 2 questions. I will put them all in one, and then you can answer as you wish. What's next for you? And is what's next the movie, or is there another project that you're working on?
You know, it's a very good question. This project has spoiled me for almost any other book. So I still have not found the next book to write. I'm working in part as a literary agent and helping to birth other people's books at the moment. So I'm working on a couple people's books and helping to sell them. The last book I did do another book between then and now, and that was a ghostwritten book, the one you mentioned about Cambridge Analytica. That was last year, and that knocked me for a loop because I had to write that in 10 weeks. And it was about stuff that wasn't very pleasant. It was about the manipulation of data by the Trump campaign in 2016. So it was pretty unpleasant, but it seemed an important thing to do. My name's not on it, but I consider it a book that I wrote because I wrote it. It was told to me, and then I had to make sense of it. But no, I'm ruined at the moment to write any other book because I still haven't found as beautiful and as epic a story. So I'm doing that work. I'm always looking for another book. And I am awaiting the making of the movie, which is always delayed by everything and now is delayed by COVID. But I'm excited by Destin Daniel Cretton, who was born on Maui, grew up on Maui, and by the Candell brothers, who grew up on Oahu. I think they had some connection to Kauai, but they literally grew up on Oahu, went to Iolani school, and they're a Hawaiian team that are making the film with the help also of Lee Tonauchi, who wrote the 3 Year Swim Club play. He's doing some work on the screenplay, and another Hawaiian filmmaker named Tai Sanga. So it's a good Hawaiian team, and I'm really pleased with that. And the producers, it is like Clint Eastwood's right-hand man who's the producer, even though Clint Eastwood's not going to direct it. I think Destin will be better. And I'm excited about that. So I'm a little involved with it, but that's one of those things I have to let go of too, because that's really their vision of what the story is going to be. And I don't know what they're going to do with it. They have their own plans.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, we got a lot of questions about the movie and what you're doing next. And you have a really big fan base over here. And like I said before, you know, after COVID passes, we want to definitely bring you back. But the book is just, it's so beautiful. And every time I, you know, pick it up and go to revisit a different section, you just fall into the history and the bygone days and those virtues and values that were so important to Hawaii. And whether we call them the values of the Nisei or the values of aloha, they're just good, common sense, beautiful values that I think we can all live by right now.
We need them. And I appreciate that. I'm a huge fan of Maui. And I think what Maui's given me is a sense of what those values are, a reminder of those. And that's what the story has done for me, is it's a touchstone for what's important, who's important, and how to live your life.
Well, I think on behalf of the Nisei Veterans Memorial Center, all of the people on this phone call and all of the people who've sent in questions, we want to thank you for sharing that story with the greater world. And we can't wait for the movie, and we'll all be there behind you supporting it. And to all of our viewers today, we want to thank you for joining us. We also want to let you know about some upcoming events. We have next month, in honor of or in remembrance of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, we have Melinda Clark is going to come on and talk to us on August 8th about her book, Waymakers for Peace, which is a collection of interviews she had done with Hibakusha, the A-bomb survivors, when she was living in Japan. We'll also be showing a documentary titled Lost Generation, which includes footage from the aftermath of the bombing. So it is very graphic war footage. Just be aware of that. But if you are interested in that, please give us a call at the center. Our website is still being worked on, but by the next time you join us, I'm sure it will be up and ready to go. But you can find us on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. And next Tuesday at 4 o'clock, we have the second in our series of the Take Leadership Talk. Try to say that 3 times quickly. It's our bamboo leadership talk, all about resilience as we face this new normal. And we're really excited to have Reverend David Turner from Church of the Crossroads coming on to talk about hope and faith in this time of pandemic and protest. And Turner, if the name is ringing a bell, his grandfather was the beloved original commanding officer, Colonel Farrant Turner of the 100th Infantry Battalion. So he has a wonderful family history, 7 generations here in Hawaii, and we're very excited to have him come on as well. So please call the center, 244-6862. Again, thank you, Julie. It's just been wonderful having you. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your knowledge, your generosity, and your graciousness. We thank you. Let's give Julie another virtual round of applause. And
thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for everyone being here. I'm sorry I couldn't answer all the questions, but thank you so much.
all right, so until next time, we bid you all a fond aloha, a hui ho, and be well and stay safe. Aloha.